The decision to rely on private capital rather than public capital, insofar as it is avoidable, is a deliberate policy of upward redistribution from bill payers, given that they're the ones who are eventually paying, to the financial sector.
Chris and Melanie, it's so good to have you on The Breakdown, my former colleagues. How are you both?
Very well, thank you for having me.
Thanks for having us, yeah.
It's a pleasure. I'm really excited about today because this episode is almost like a rejoinder to the Brett Christopher's episode, which was, for anyone listening, our very first episode way back at the beginning, where we talked about why the private sector isn't the ideal vehicle for delivering a clean energy future and all the many complicated reasons that is. So I encourage people to go back and listen to that episode to dig into the details again. But today we're going to talk about the opposite side of that coin, which is, okay, if the private sector is failing us, what actually is the solution and what can we do about it? So I'm excited to dig into that, but I think it'd be helpful to just start with a brief recap of some of the basics. So Melanie, I'll start with you. Could you just unpack for us a little bit why this is so important? And by that, I mean why decarbonizing electricity is such an important task.
Yeah. So we like to say that electricity is the linchpin of the transition. There are 5 major sectors that need to be decarbonized, but decarbonization of other sectors, such as industrial production, home heating, transportation, are all really dependent upon electrification, so that needs to be clean. And then also electricity is still currently a large source of carbon emissions in most countries, including the UK. But then that said, it's quite a large undertaking. And so I think even though it's been an area where I think climate policy has long focused on electricity, so it's one of the areas where in most countries it is the farthest along in terms of decarbonization, or many will point to that as being the case. It still is really a long way off from being accomplished, and it's a really daunting and complicated task to do.
So what does that task actually look like? Chris, if you could lay out for me, what are we actually talking about doing in terms of the steps we need to take to decarbonize electricity? And you can use the UK as an example, but I think it applies to lots of other places.
Sure. Well, perhaps it is easiest to begin by just laying out what the different components are of the energy system, because it's a complicated thing, and there are many different stages along the supply chain. But a simple schematic view would have your generators at the top, and these are the wind turbines, the solar farms, the gas turbines, the nuclear power stations that actually are in the business of creating the electricity that are then transmitted through the physical infrastructure, the national grid, the pylons, the cables that run the length of the country, eventually to the homes where people, or to the businesses where people consume it. And you have the high voltage, long distance transmission cables that we refer to as the national grid in the UK. In most places, it's just called the grid. That then, after that arterial journey, you then have these capillaries where, at the local level, where in different regions you have these distribution networks. It's much more low voltage. So if you see just a little wooden pylon on the side of the road carrying about three wires, yeah.
I've never seen those before.
That's your distribution network. They're usually owned by different companies depending on what region you're in. In the UK, it's all completely unbundled. So each step within this is handled by different companies. And then it reaches the home, and the financial relationship with the consumer is then handled by the retailer. So these are the likes of the people whose logo is on your bill when you receive it, basically, and they don't physically do anything, but they are handling the relationship between you and the generators. So you can already see it's getting pretty complicated. And they're the ones who are tasked with purchasing electricity from the generators on a half-hourly basis and doing whatever it takes to sort of hedge the volatility there and provide you with a fairly easily packaged bill. So to return to your first question, which I'm beginning to forget, what does a public ownership in the energy system looks like? Well, it depends which components of that system that you're actually talking about. We know that the biggest part of shifting to net zero is building out the generation end of that by just having way more generation plants that are climate friendly, that are low carbon, whether it's fully low carbon like renewable energy, or where the carbon is either like mitigated to a level or otherwise offset or captured and stored. And then there's a lot more build out of the transmission, the grid that is needed to actually carry those electrons to your house, given that we're going to be using gas to heat our homes anymore, potentially. So you just need more infrastructure to carry it. And we advocate public ownership of basically all of that, partly because you want it to be a systemic whole. But we advocate specifically that the majority of investment in new generation capacity needs to be public funded for reasons that we can get into.
I think kind of following on what Chris has just said, we really stress the fractured nature of the system to really point out that to transform this system, it's really a matter of creating a new beating heart while maintaining the current beating heart and transplanting them in process and keeping all of the networks and rebuilding a new system at the same time, because the way that the fossil system works is very incongruous with the renewable system. So it's not just merely a matter of replacing one for one clean generation with fossil generation, for example. In terms of even just like the regional, like geospatial aspects of the transition for this sector, fossil fuels were kind of cited in particular places because of the logic of how that system works. But then to build a renewable system, it really is just a matter of rebuilding the whole thing once over, which previously had been done in the UK under public ownership and through direct public investment. And now we're trying to kind of transform the system and rebuild it when there are these fragmented actors who kind of, even though they all operate under the logic of profit imperative and what have you, they do have distinct logics of their own where you're trying to kind of marry the whole project together by trying to herd cats in every one of these aspects of the sector, basically, and trying to get them to cohere on the simultaneous project of keeping the grid balanced in real time, which is like a very complex, engineering problem. Like electricity is quite a modern marvel that we're able to kind of harness this kind of wacky, crazy thing, which can be really vulnerable to just infrastructural damage if things kind of go awry on a real time basis. But then also trying to invest in new capacity in this new system, and often those two things are quite in misalignment, especially when trying to again cohere all of these actors along this grand project.
Right. So I want to talk about something that I think is on a lot of our minds, which is, the scale of our energy bills. Very high, particularly in the UK and a lot of Europe over the past few years. And a lot of that comes down to how our electricity market is designed. And we talked about that on Brett's episode, so we won't revisit too much of those details here. But it's been very clear, and apologies for always using the UK as an example, but I think it's indicative. Keir Starmer running as leader of the Labour Party in our current election, which may or may not have been resolved by the time we put this out. We'll see. They've really been championing their idea of Great British Energy, which is some kind of public energy generating company, on the idea that it will cut everyone's bills. So Chris, over to you. Is that the case? And kind of zooming out more broadly for everyone, what does public ownership of energy offer us in terms of cost savings, if any? How is it different to the way that we're doing it right now?
Sure. There are two components to that over the long term. One is the fact simply that renewable energy in general tends to be cheaper on average over the lifetime of those assets than fossil fuel energy tends to be, or at least has been for the last few years, and that's going to remain the case by and large. So insofar as a public energy company can accelerate the build out of those cheaper renewable energies, then you will correspondingly see a gradual lowering of your bills over the years as that energy comes online. And we can revisit later the reasons why a public energy sector can accelerate, public energy company can accelerate that. But the more direct reason is just that the state famously has a lower cost of capital than the private sector. Principally, it's able to borrow at much lower costs. And this matters hugely because renewable energy is in particular very, very capital sensitive. It's all of the costs are front loaded in the building of the plants, which tends to be quite expensive. But then thereafter, the actual operating costs are next to zero. So your costs are all front-loaded, your revenues are all back-loaded, which means you're extremely sensitive to the cost of borrowing and also the cost of your equity if you're using equity to finance part of it. And the usual debt-to-equity split is about 80% debt, 20% equity. Now, the cost of capital for the governments tends to be about the cost of borrowing tends to be about 1.5 to 2.5 percentage points cheaper than for private companies of the specific credit rating that is usually assigned to these renewable projects. And that sounds not very much.
No,
but,
it sounds pretty small.
But when you consider the sensitivity to the cost of capital, the International Energy Agency estimates that a 2 percentage point increase in the cost of capital increases the levelized cost of electricity, that's the average break-even cost of it, by 20%, which is actually huge. And given that 2% is roughly the average spread between public and private, and given that those capital payments essentially go back to the financial sector where the capital has been sourced from. Essentially what you're saying is that the decision to rely on private capital rather than public capital, insofar as it is avoidable, is a deliberate policy of upward redistribution from bill payers, given that they're the ones who are eventually paying, to the financial sector. And when you combine that with the fact that as we know from the work of Isabella Weber, for example, that energy is a systemically significant price. It's not just one among many things in the basket that you spend.
It's not just avocado toast. You could
choose
not to buy.
You mean it feeds into all sorts of other sectors?
Yeah, you get it on your bills in the first place, which is damaging your household spending power, but also all of the other companies who rely on electricity to do their things, which quite a lot of them.
Pretty much everyone.
These cost pressures ramify throughout the whole input-output nexus. And you can make a very compelling case that, especially in the UK and Europe, less so in the US, that the inflationary episode of the last few years has been driven overwhelmingly by the price of electricity. Not just gas, but also the inability to price non-gas electricity properly. And then on top of the borrowing costs, you have the dividends that you pay in perpetuity to shareholders. So the 20% of your financing that is coming from equity carries an even higher cost of capital because equity holders take on more of the risk. Whereas in the case of a public entity, it's possible to pay only as many dividends as it takes to make the original investor whole again. They don't need to be generating this much longer return.
In the UK context, the big issue with prices with the electricity sector during the kind of 2022 crisis really were tied to the way that, again, the UK has this really fractured system where they're trying to cohere all of these different actors around this really important project of maintaining the grid balancing over time through payments. And so the reason why electricity prices surged so much in the first place is because structurally the UK tries to tie the price of all electricity to the price of fossil gas, which the reason for it is to kind of, it's quite technical in the weeds of like how to kind of make sure that there's enough capacity to meet demand in real time in the context of a kind of still gas heavy sector. But point being, if we had public ownership of assets, there's the ability to just directly control if we're generating electricity or not, and kind of delinking prices from the price of gas in the first place, just kind of making sure that we're operating the system in a really efficient way and not kind of letting shocks to the system really ricochet in that way.
When you're in the business of advocating for public energy, you often run the risk of being interpreted as just sentimental, and that your critique of of finance is that it's avaricious and profit-seeking in a way that is almost like blood-sucking, which is not the argument that we're making. I mean, to the extent that that does happen, you know, then we do criticize it.
It's
but
like,
there's
that
also,
it were.
but there's our critique is also fundamentally a critique of the fragmentation of agency and the problem, as Melanie describes, in cohering these actors to do the kind of thing that you, the sort of system planner, want to do for the sake of coherence. And people will often say of the cost of capital and other parts of profit making that this is just a legitimate reward that investors are being given for the risk that they take on. And you know, to a large extent, that may well be true. But there's one thing to say that you're compensating people adequately for the risk that they take on. It's another thing to make a policy decision to create risks that could otherwise be avoided. And you know, some of the risks that we're talking about, just the sort of operational risk, for example, in like trying to go out to sea to build an offshore wind farm, sure, that risk is unavoidable. But some of them are just risks about how much of the surplus from the resulting assets can the private company capture when they are essentially engaging in transactions with other parts of the system. So we really want to frame the problem in terms of which risks are avoidable and which risks simply exist in the borders between actors, which is why we also make the case that a public company can just bring certainty to the investment pipeline for a whole bunch of reasons relating to coherence, but also relating to being freed from the profit imperative and being able to invest on the basis of social need and of system level need rather than the profitability of the isolated project within that system.
I have a question about the way that we currently are trying to decarbonize electricity. And again, we talked with Brett a lot about the role of different types of subsidy and in the UK in particular, what's called our contracts for difference mechanism, which is, you could think of it as a form of subsidy, although it's a bit more complicated than that. And maybe one of you can lay that out. But I want to play devil's advocate slightly because, you know, I'm sort of all on board with the arguments that you're making about how public ownership can help us be better coordinated and sort of escape the constraints of the profit motive and you know, do things more cheaply. All of that I think sounds brilliant and correct. But you know, to take the UK as an example, you know, our emissions from our electricity sector have fallen off enormously. I think it's close to 80% since 1990, which sounds to me very significant. And you know, we've done that through different types of subsidy for the private sector, and it's, you know, to the layman seems like it's been fairly successful. So why public ownership now? And you know, will that do anything differently to the kind of success that we're already seeing? And obviously I've drawn on the UK there as an example, but you know, I think that logic could apply to a lot of places where, you know, electricity is run through private profit-making companies. Convince me.
Okay, well, I mean, the contracts for difference scheme is a good place to begin, just because it is by and large the gold standard.
And it's proliferating globally.
Yeah. So it started within the UK and has been picked up as best practice internationally, precisely because it is pretty successful relative to all of the other private-centric models. So it's worth like rehearsing why it's successful before getting into what the weaknesses are. And those reasons have, like I say, largely to do with the question of certainty. So, you know, certainty is the thing that investors crave as a precondition for basically overcoming what Keynes referred to as the liquidity preference and sinking their capital into these long-term projects from which they won't be able to get cash out of it for a long time.
The liquidity preference being they'd just prefer to have cash at the end of the day.
Yeah, or you want to put your capital into assets that you can eventually sell pretty quickly.
Right, just get out of if you need to.
Yeah, if you need to get out of Dodge, you want to be able to do that, whereas actual physical investments don't offer you that privilege a lot of the time. So you need certainty in terms of the return that you're likely to make relative to the risk that you're taking on. You want to reduce that risk. And what CFDs do is they overcome the enormous volatility in wholesale prices in spot markets by just fixing the price, the effective price that you will receive for your electricity. So essentially bringing certainty to the revenue side of the profitability equation. And you then, on that basis, are able to undertake the investment decisions safe in that knowledge. And this is also so this has been key to unlocking a lot of investment in offshore wind in particular, as well as in other technologies, and did so relatively successfully until the recent failed auction in September of 2023, which have to do with the maximum price that the government was allowing people to bid into the auctions, but the price fixing occurs at the beginning of the process, before you start going through however many years, roughly about 6 years, of actually building that wind farm or other generation plant. So there's a lot of cost uncertainty that intervenes in those remaining 6 years or so before the plant comes online and you're able to realize those revenues. And over in ordinary times, those costs had a little bit of risk attached to them because they're big projects. But more recently, there's been a lot of turbulence with geopolitical, macro-financial, ecological, that creates ever greater uncertainty on the cost side. So essentially, you're fixing prices. The price that you fix, which is your criterion for deciding to invest in the first place, has to incorporate a lot of ex-ante uncertainties on the cost side.
Ex-ante.
Well, forward-looking from that point, before you then incur those risks, and then the plant comes online, you start making revenues. But by the time it starts making revenues at the price that you fixed however many years ago, a lot of those uncertainties that the price was trying to incorporate in the form of a risk premium, well, they're no longer risks anymore because they're in the past. So ex post,
you had to do it.
You then spend the remaining 15 years charging a price that is arguably higher than it turns out to have been justified. We argue that a public generator doesn't have to go through that process because the reason that you're investing in the first place is because you know with existential certainty that you need to undertake these investments one way or another in order to meet our climate targets. We know with macroeconomic certainty that bringing this cheap energy online will be a huge boon to the economy. So we don't need to engage in any price fixing at the beginning in order to just go ahead and do the investment. You're going to encounter lots of costs along the way, but once it's online, you can look back at those costs and say, okay, here's the price that I need to charge in order to break even. So essentially, you don't want to be in a situation where you're fossilizing yesterday's uncertainties into tomorrow's prices for 15 years at a time. And that's sort of the crux of our critique. But I mean, there's other elements that maybe Melanie can go into.
Yeah, and I think the question of is a given climate policy, especially for like a really grand thing like power sector decarbonization, successful, I think that there is an issue in kind of the climate community of focusing on the fact that there has been some level of development as opposed to the criteria being, are we actually achieving the target? And so definitely it's true that the UK power sector in particular has really benefited from first the dramatic decline of coal, and then also these policy tools that we've been talking about certainly have brought renewables online, which is no small feat. I mean, 30 years ago, there was no utility scale renewables in the world, or it's just, just like very, very small. So it's not to say that these policy tools haven't been effective in a certain way, but the question is, are we going to completely decarbonize this sector by this target, and then also keep going? It's, whatever the target date is for power sector decarbonization, we just need so much more electricity to meet demand and electrification of other sectors. It's really just a moving target no matter what. And so the issue, I think, with the CFDs and kind of other subsidy regimes that have come and gone, in our view, is that they have been successful, more or less so. I mean, the UK example has been quite successful, but measured against the criteria of like no renewables. The criteria should be the decarbonization of that sector. And then I think also to kind of add on to it, as Chris has been alluding to, the issues that we've seen with the CFDs, I think are quite striking because, again, this model has proliferated globally. In the US, for example, offshore wind in the Northeast is being kind of run in a very similar fashion. And I think it really points to this issue where it's not the case that the state or any kind of system planner is saying that we need this much capacity to come online, and even kind of more defined than that, saying in this particular area, we need utility scale solar, or we need utility scale onshore wind, because it kind of like meets with the needs of the grid or our kind of plan for decarbonizing the sector. It's much more ad hoc. The way that these policies run, it's a bit more of a general volume of capacity is very indirectly targeted, and then it could or could not be met through this auction process for getting the subsidy in the first place. And so it's very generalized, and it's not really meeting the system like level needs of both like the capacity target in general, but then also making sure that key critical projects are being done. And I think point being with these tools, they're already really strong state interventions. Like we've really discussed in our work that even the existence of this policy regime in the UK context, if it were kind of to go, much farther into the future, would really have a very transformative effect on the structure of the UK electricity sector. It would, as we discussed earlier, there's these fractured actors, and there's an existence of a retail market, for example. But if CFDs were kind of to take over the whole of the electricity system, over time, there basically would be no need for a retailer because it's all fixed price contracts. So there's kind of like no price discovery function. And so that said, it's really strong state intervention already that's really trying to get these actors to do what we want to do, but still in this very indirect way that I think only makes sense if the goal is to maintain private ownership and private investment. And I think that just becomes untenable in the face of both bringing capacity online. I think we also haven't quite touched upon the issue of how do we actually phase out fossil gas through these policies, because in quite a lot of this regime, it's very much the assumption that if you simply bring enough generation online, fossil gas will just fall by the wayside, which I think we both want and don't want, because if that happens in a very disorderly process, you'll get price instability, and it'll be kind of like thwarting the same project to begin with.
So in sum, rather than trying to ever more prod the private sector to do it, just kind of why not do it yourself?
Yeah, the best way to de-risk investment in the favored lingo is to just do it yourself.
Yeah.
And I have another question for you, Melanie. I devil's advocated Chris already, so over to you now. Is, one of the examples I think that I was surprised to hear about when I first learned about it, of existing public ownership of energy utilities is, of all places, Tennessee. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which was set up in part as a kind of publicly owned energy utility. And, it had this kind of great, ambitious vision when it was first set up in sort of the middle of the 20th century, but has since become famously one of America's dirtiest utilities. It keeps getting, year after year an F grade from, I think, the Sierra Club on their kind of dirty energy metric. So, using that as an example, what makes you think that public ownership is inherently going to be a cleaner form of energy?
And so I think the TVA example, I think, is useful because it's also, I think, really mirrors certain other public utilities in global context. Like I think Eskom in South Africa famously is this public utility that's one of the coal baddies in global context. But so I think it's important to kind of stress with like what was the TVA created to do, and then how can political economy shape things over time. So in the US context, before the Great Depression, electrification was very ad hoc. It was developing in more urban areas. And so the rural areas of the United States had yet to be electrified before the New Deal. And so one of the great achievements of the New Deal was the creation of both the Tennessee Valley Authority, but then also a series of rural cooperatives that really took to task the creation of a functioning electricity system in a huge swath of the U.S. that just hadn't had electricity before. And so the TVA is the only, actually I forget the classification because there are a few other public power authorities in the U.S. context, but the TVA is kind of this outlier in terms of being a federally owned and controlled and quite large public utility in the U.S. context. And it was created, and I think the title Tennessee Valley Authority is quite striking because the idea behind it was not just to be a public power authority. It really was tasked with developing this entire area of the Tennessee Valley. So its kind of guiding mandate was to provide electricity, but also to be kind of doing regional development planning such that, new manufacturing wanting to come to the area can kind of get hooked up to the grid quite quickly. And they also did quite a lot around, I think, waterworks and building dams, for example, and other aspects of regional development planning. And I think it's important to stress that this institution really was able to build something that hadn't been there before. And precisely because of the sort of issues that Chris and I raised, where it just simply wasn't profitable, there was no incentive for a private actor to be providing this public good and this just really big infrastructure project. And I think that's true for other public utilities we see in global context. I think in most of the developing world, for example, electricity is still largely publicly owned, and the reason for that is because, the question simply who will build an electricity system in Indonesia, for example. I think it just pretty much is always going to be the public in some way, even if there's some mechanisms by which we're trying to subsidize the private sector, for example. But that said, even though we certainly all have very progressive left-wing politics, I think we're attuned to political economy, and any institution is going to be subject to those forces. I don't think the answer is as simple as just saying we create public ownership. Again, thinking about this grand project that we really need to undertake, who are the actors who can undertake it? I think that we're so far away from that point in terms of the reliance on private sector right now that kind of pointing to the public as the alternative, it's not just to say, it's like far-fetched or to ignore the issues that we see with other public utilities, but I think the question is, how do we create the right actors that can do it? And so even if there are public utilities currently that are not performing the way that we want, at least they, in terms of the architectural form of the public enterprise, they can be subject to democratic transformation to be able to then do the project that we need them to, whereas the private company can't. And so I think just kind of we need to be building that alternative, even if current examples of it or instantiations of it aren't quite yet up to the task.
Yeah, you're not going to have that analogous democratic transformation of private institutions when the only tool that you have to induce them to do desirable things is the profit imperative. And the more you have this proliferation of a system of components with different needs to do different things at different times to serve different functions, you then have to backwards engineer a whole load of market mechanisms in order to induce them to do that. And it might be very clever, but cleverness is not always the end objective of the energy system.
What? So if this may sound like a sort of silly question, but if the arguments that you're making, we're getting increasingly clever and unnecessarily complex to try and cajole people into doing the things we want. It's cheaper for the public sector to do it. They can coordinate it more efficiently. They're liberated from the profit motive if you're sort of talking about entire public ownership. Why aren't we doing this? What do you think are the reasons why we're so stuck in the existing obsession and fixation with the private sector? And how do you think that we can get beyond that? And further to that, are there any examples where that might be happening? Always look for a little bit of optimism somewhere.
As in, why are we so fixated on the private sector?
Yeah, why are we so stuck with the private sector model? I mean, it's a slightly speculative question, but I'd be interested to know why you think that is.
I mean, it's interesting that people see, they tend to work on the assumption that competition is the thing that drives everything. And it certainly drives a lot, but there's less attention to the question of where is the locus of competition and what is the criterion that it's selecting for in order to select for particular ways of doing things, among others. Our critique of fragmentation and of system incoherence and irrationality sort of goes against the grain of a lot of like antitrust thinking, whereby you need to just create competition, and where it doesn't exist organically, you have to sort of artificially create these markets of various artificial kinds. Whereas we say actually that creates these boundaries between agents, and actually what you do kind of just need vertical integration. I mean, it's a word that gets a bad rap because the context it's associated with are contexts in which it harms horizontal competitions between competitors to the detriment of consumers when those vertically integrated companies are working under the profit motive, because there's then nothing to really stop them maximizing their profits by predating upon consumers.
And vertically integrated meaning it's a single owner at every step of the chain. So that would be like generators and the grid and all in one go.
Yeah, because at the moment you have these sort of these different components of the system are engaged in these transactional squabbles, essentially distributional conflicts. For example, when a new wind farm wants to connect to the grid, they have to apply to National Grid for a connection agreement. And then, based on some opaque formula, the grid will give them this number, but then it's not guaranteed that cost is apportioned fairly between the grid and the generator. And the question of how you apportion that sort of ends up stymieing the investment pipeline. It's interesting that when we talk about projects that have failed recently or have hit the rocks, you can take the example of BP, who have had offshore wind projects in the US off the East Coast, where again it was a sort of model where you had price fixing agreements, and they would be creating this electricity and then selling it to customers. And given the sort of cost inflation, the higher interest rates and so on, the cost at which they'd agreed that was no longer going to be satisfactory to meeting their returns. So they ended up having to try and renegotiate their contracts. They sold a lot of their equity stakes to some of their partners and stuff like that. It really, it was a very laborious process that really held up the construction of the wind farm. But the same company, BP, also had projects off the north coast of Germany where they weren't selling to customers. They were only producing electricity for their own internal operations. They were selling to BP, essentially, where the question of, but what price is going to make the return on our wind farm? Well, it doesn't really matter because it's just a transaction between your left hand and your right hand. The risks surrounding it have been completely subsumed by this larger balance sheet of the corporation BP, and that's that kind of and their earnings calls. They've spoken at length about. They basically see integration benefits, and the standard ideology among policymakers of competition created by segmenting out markets doesn't really take into account those kind of system level benefits. I mean, it may have had better purchase in a previous world of dispatchable electricity that's less capital intensive, but it's not as doesn't have as much purchase in the world that we're trying to transition towards.
Right, and it speaks to the kind of double speak I think that Brett talked about a little bit, which is kind of advocating for all these things like competition and free markets while doing everything in your power as an actor within them to try and avoid the actual forces of competition. Melanie, just to pick up on the second part of my question there, how do you think we actually kind of action any of this? We feel quite far from it right now. And again, are there any places where you see the kind of seeds of hope or some of the change toward the vision of a system that you're describing?
Yeah, I think, and this probably tails from what Chris has just said, but I think that we face an issue with this reliance on private ownership, private investment. I think because that just has been the status quo architecture of the power sector in particular. And I think that there are certainly growing movements and forces and kind of a general tenor of climate movement, climate policy world that I think has moved closer to embracing state action, especially state economic action, not just, more anodyne types of policies. But I think that said, there's still a vision of there being just like public investment in terms of financing as opposed to the state undertaking key economic activities, the way that we would argue public ownership of the system should be done. And I think that to me kind of reads as this inherent caution where there's this time crunch. We have to do things by a certain time. Therefore, is it worth trying to upend this big system? Or if you kind of equate any kind of state action in a more substantive way with anti-capitalism or kind of like not being capitalism, are you then throwing in the question of, do we need to completely overthrow capitalism before we can undertake the transition?
Do it.
No. But I do think that, public or private ownership and private investment, I think that you do see in global context, public ownership can be compatible with capitalism in certain ways. I think, China, I think, is an example of as you've asked, like where the transition seems to be going well in terms of the state is really the majority force behind a really tremendous renewable rollout in the Chinese context. And it is quite interesting. I'm not an expert on China, but just, broad strokes, the way that it's functioning is in China, there's state-subordinated financial system. And then on top of that, even more generous policies by the central bank to even further subsidize renewables through financing mechanisms. But then ultimately, that is just kind of general accommodative conditions for the fact that it's state-owned enterprises that are undertaking the majority of investment in expansion of renewables and building out the grid, which there are certainly issues with it. I think Chinese political economy, again, is quite interesting. So there's tensions between the municipal governments, regional governments, and the national government. And then also there's an issue of there's still coal capacity build out, although I think that's more to do with having sustainable supplies to kind of meet grid balancing over time, and it will be phased out appropriately over time. But I think that said, kind of going back to the original point, I think that it's easy to think that it's like a yes-no question overcoming capitalism or not to achieve the transition. And something that we kind of stress at Commonwealth is that the achievement of overthrowing capitalism is an iterative process. It kind of, I think, is just like asset by asset, sector by sector, how are we socializing the economy and like transforming it? And I think that that can be pushed in ways where, certainly bringing the electricity system under public ownership would be both transformative and hugely disruptive of the status quo, but also not in certain ways. It can be made quite amenable or compatible with an overlying capitalist system. And the tension there is to be driving for that. And then also not just stopping there and moving forward. But I think that in terms of like the climate community that's a bit more cautious about these transformative policies, I think it is important to stress that it's not just like, oh yeah, we need to completely overthrow capital to achieve big things, even if by achieving those big things, we are hopefully overcoming capital. Or it's important to stress that that is the politics, capital, even if they're not in the electricity sector, might have an interest in preventing creeping socialization of public investment because it threatens their control in other sectors as well.
So just to pick up on a point that Melanie made there, how do you see, Chris, this project of public ownership in the energy system fitting into a bigger kind of question or project of changing our economic system more broadly?
I guess, certain parts of the left like to talk about the idea of non-reformist reforms. The idea is that, they're marginal steps that basically give you a foothold that you can then leverage into broader socialization of sectors of the economy at a much larger scale. That is one of the capabilities that these kind of institutions do afford you, whereby, if you were able to exercise creeping control of the creation and distribution of energy and the terms on which it is available to people, you do then have the ability, for example, to establish a human right to electricity. You can establish not just the right itself, but the institutional architecture that actually delivers upon it. So, for example, there are lots of organizations who have been working on campaigning on the idea of a social tariff in electricity. A few years ago, we had genuine real resource constraints as to how much electricity could actually be produced. and we were relying on the price mechanism to distribute it in a way that did not discriminate on need, for example, between a family that is trying to feed their children and heat their homes versus someone who just wants to heat up their private swimming pool. So this is just one example, but it's quite an illustrative example of what you're able to do if you're then able to say, look, these things are going to be allocated to people according to a fundamentally different set of criteria. And I think we're going to run into that kind of problem a lot more frequently going forward. A lot of I don't want to step into the degrowth debate, but it's becoming increasingly clear that the actual sort of material resource boundaries of the planet are going to be much more difficult to navigate and negotiate without certain kinds of intervention into the allocation of real resources to people in ways that the price mechanism is simply not equipped to do. And energy is arguably one of the first steps on the way to that.
One of the points that came up in my conversation with Brett, and which I love you, Brett, but feel as though you didn't quite answer, would love to pick up on with you guys, is this idea that, this is all fine and well for countries like the US or the UK or broadly the kind of wealthy northern countries of the world to pursue because we kind of have the freedom and capacity within our state systems to do that, and that this is something that isn't available to the global south, within which there are many countries that are going to be increasingly key to global decarbonization. And I asked him whether he thinks that's the case, and we kind of just need to leave those countries to the whims of the private sector because of the constraints of the global financial system. What would you say to that? Do you think that's true, or do you think that kind of misrepresents the problem? I'll start, Melanie, with you.
Yeah, I think I understand what Brett is saying to a certain extent, because it is true that the global economic system is structured in a very inherently hierarchical way, where certain states, kind of thinking of the G7, the US is kind of the apex predator, but there are other countries that fall in this category as well that really have a monopoly of global economic power, which kind of feeds into then structurally certain capacities that are denied to other countries, sort of along this hierarchy. So the US can spend money and allocate resources just in a structurally different way than global south countries can, and it's all very interrelated. Could get into the technicalities, but I think the most important point is that this is a changeable system, but currently it's structured along this hierarchy that is premised upon denying certain economic capacities to the global south. And so it's important to stress this capacities as opposed to just money, because I think what's really necessary is for countries to have the capacity to undertake transitions, and that's being denied through sort of financial and other forms of global economic hierarchy. And I think with that, it's true that the current structures are denying financial and other resources to the global south to be able to undertake the transition. And so from there, though, I don't think that we can just say that the private sector can be left to the task, because I think that gets into kind of this question of what actually is the transition in general, but then also for energy in particular. I think the way that a lot of this policy rhetoric and real policies and projects take form in real world are very ad hoc. You can kind of create subsidies that will juice investor returns, and therefore, certain renewable projects in the global south will come online because of it. But that is not necessarily going to cohere into the grand project of creating a new clean electricity system in any given country, and then also faces issues with, in kind of global climate policy context, the issue is not just kind of increasing renewables, but also how to prevent more fossil capacity coming online, and then also phasing out existing fossil capacity. So it's a huge issue in certain countries that have been trying to pursue a development path that have been heavily investing in coal, for example, because it is a cheaper source of electricity for them. Even 20 years ago, renewables were just significantly more expensive. And now there just is this huge financial mismatch where countries that are even, probably arguably much wealthier than other countries in the global south, such as Indonesia and India, there's certainly a different class of power and kind of further up the hierarchy than, say, country in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, aside from South Africa. But that said, how can they kind of retire coal plants earlier than the current timeline makes sense? It's totally enmeshed in questions of debt and financial resources. I think that all just points to this idea that de-risking private investment doesn't really work, period, in order to achieve system-level transformation and build-out, even in the global north. And then in the global south in particular, I think it's not going to work well. And then on top of it, these questions around like retiring kind of current assets early is like not really going to be financed by that. And then I think kind of more broadly to that point, so even as private investment, I think, will fail to deliver transitions in these countries, I think that we're also kind of adding further issues and kind of this burden onto countries where by taking and subsidizing private investment in order to get even just like a small amount of projects online, it's kind of increasing debt burdens and also increasing the amount of rentier, dollar-denominated outflows coming out of the country that underlying economies just simply can't handle. And so just in general, it's not a workable option. I think it's not just like a normative issue of, we don't like private capital and would love to have a just, climate transition in global context. It really just is a matter of, global economic justice and redistribution of wealth and power is functionally necessary to achieve the transition in global context, which I think Brett would probably agree with, but I just think it's really important to stress that de-risking simply won't work. So if we want a transition, we have to push for that redistribution so the countries can undertake their own public transitions.
The global financial architecture is set up in such a way that rich countries are able to borrow at a much lower rate than poorer countries because their governments have much more credibility with the financial markets, who are their key counterparties in the whole process of issuing debt. And incidentally, these are the countries who have the fewest investment needs compared to those global south countries who have the greatest level of catch-up to get on with. Also, even in the situation where it does work, we've just had a long conversation about why the private de-risking model is nonetheless far less desirable and basically withholds a whole raft of benefits that the public model can unlock. So if we are to accept the idea that that global south countries simply don't have the fiscal space to unlock those benefits, then we are essentially talking about a two-tiered global world in which the richer countries are sort of realizing both a faster transition and one that benefits its people economically at a much greater rate, and the poorer world where the infrastructure there has been provided by foreign private capital, and yes, and as Melanie says, the outflows are going to be a continuing drain on countries for whom that has already been a systemic part of their predicament. So yes, we need. I mean, if that is the risk, then we need to think very, very carefully about how the global financial architecture can be changed to avoid that, because it clearly seems like an unacceptable situation, even if it's one that appears likely. And it's also a very special instance of a broader problem with the transition globally, which is that, as we've described, a lot of the new technologies that we're going to have to be moving to are the kind of things that require a lot of capital investment upfront.
Which is fixed equipment. It's not just financial. It's like machines and things. Yeah.
It's fixed equipment that is then sort of cheap to run on an ongoing basis, but the payments that you make for it are essentially back payments for that investment to begin with, and you're sort of locked into that position for a long time. If those back payments are being fed in the form of rents to private capital that is already sort of managed to gorge itself over the years to the position that it's in, then we risk locking ourselves into that situation for a very long time. it's imperative that the global south avoids that predicament, but it's also imperative that the global north does so too, and that we should be alive to those risks in the future.